Sydney Loofe was born on the 21st of August 1993 in Neely, Nebraska, to parents Susie and George Loofe. She was the middle child, having two siblings, Mackenzie and Levi, who she was very close to. Her father George was the principal at Neely Oakdale High School, a position that he had held for nearly 2 decades at the school where Sydney would later attend before graduating in 2011. At the school, Sydney had played basketball, volleyball and golf, and was active in the band. Following graduation, Sydney moved to Lincoln after she agreed to transfer for work at the Menards home improvement store. This was around 3 hours away from her family home. She moved there alone but remained in constant contact with her family. Her parents didn't worry about her too much because they described her as a responsible young adult. As you can imagine, moving away from your hometown, especially on your own at 24 years old, proved lonely for Sydney. It was soon after she arrived in Lincoln that she confided in her friends that she began to use the dating app Tinder to try and find a partner, and it didn't take her long to do so. On the 11th of November 2017, Sydney had begun talking with a 26-year-old woman who called herself Audrey. They chatted about what kind of foods and restaurants they liked, smoking marijuana, and where they grew up before eventually making plans to meet on November the 14th. As they excitedly planned their first date, Sydney questioned Audrey, whose real name was actually Bailey Boswell, to ask if the date would be just the two of them. Bailey responded, "Yes, of course, LOL." The 14th soon rolled around, and that evening, Bailey and Sydney had their first encounter. Bailey had picked Sydney up from her home, and they drove around talking and smoking marijuana, before Bailey once again dropped Sydney off back at home. Before departing ways, they agreed to another date the following night. Before Sydney went to bed that night, she received a text from Bailey that read, "Good night, gorgeous." Sydney was so happy and hopeful that something good had come along. The next day, Sydney worked her shift at the Menards in North Lincoln, with a second date with Bailey planned for that night. Sydney openly expressed how excited she was to a co-worker. She was hopeful that their relationship would become something more, and was excited to see where this was heading. Evening finally came around, and Sydney's excitement was clear to see once again when she posted an image to her Snapchat account. The Snapchat was a selfie of her all dressed up and smiling with the caption, "Ready for my date," followed with a smiling emoji with heart eyes. Little was Sydney to know was that this would be the last Snapchat she would ever get to post. Soon after this image was taken, Bailey Boswell picked Sydney up from her home once again, even messaging her on Tinder to confirm that she was outside. The messages showed that they had planned another date to drive around, smoke marijuana, and get to know each other. However, things would take a darker turn when Bailey eventually took Sydney to an apartment in Wilbur. This was confirmed using phone records of Sydney's mobile, before her phone eventually stopped transmitting that night. The next day, on November the 16th, Sydney didn't turn up to her shift at work. This concerned her co-workers, who she had confided in that she would be attending a date with a woman from Tinder the previous night. Her co-workers weren't the only people who began to worry for Sydney's well-being. It turns out that she hadn't been responding to her family's texts, and so, her parents, Susie and George, made their way over to her apartment. They would be amongst the first to enter her residence, turning over a laptop to investigators and noting that nothing unusual was found inside. Her cell phone, ID and debit card weren't found in her apartment, but her car was in the driveway. Sydney's parents said that they planned to have Thanksgiving dinner together, and Sydney had to work the next day for Black Friday, but she had never turned up to either, something very uncharacteristic of Sydney. It didn't take investigators long to track down the woman who Sydney had been on a date with the night she vanished. Bailey Boswell, however, denied any involvement in Sydney's disappearance and stated, "I went to take her home and she asked me to drop her off at a friend's house, so I did so. I gave her my number. We were planning on going to the casino that weekend. I haven't heard from her since. The police, however, remained very suspicious of Bailey, and it seemed for good reason. The police identified two people of interest in relation to Sydney's disappearance: Bailey Boswell and a 51-year-old man named Aubrey Trail, who was found to be Bailey's boyfriend. Because of this, the pair began to get a large amount of attention from the press, leading them to release videos to their social media accounts indicating that they had been wronged by police and had nothing to do with Sydney's disappearance.
Good morning, Lincoln and Omaha and probably several other places. This is Aubrey Trail and this is Bailey Boswell. I guess y'all also know her as Audrey. But we've spent the last few days watching ourselves being slammed and crucified in the newspapers and the news and everything else, so we thought it was time we had our say. The Lincoln Police Department apparently wants everyone to believe that we're hiding, that we haven't talked to them, that we're avoiding them. You've already crucified us in the newspapers. You've already crucified us on Facebook. You know, in America, I sure thought it was a trial first, but I guess not. You've heard all of this stuff about my criminal history. All true. As far as I know, I'm not wanted for anything. I'm a person of interest, and I'm not really running from anything. I pray for Sydney. I hope she's found soon. I wish the family the best. I'm sorry that she wasn't with you on Thanksgiving, and that's pretty much all I can say for now. So this has pretty much cost me my life, and I appreciate that from the Lincoln Police Department and the FBI and all those other agencies. Here's Bailey to tell you whatever she wants to.
Hi, good morning. I'm Bailey, Audrey on Tinder, and this really isn't about me. This is about Sydney. I met her on a Tuesday. We drove around Lincoln, smoked weed, had a great time. We hit it off. Picked her up the next night at her house. We drove around, smoked weed again. I went to take her home, and she asked me to drop her off at a friend's house. So, I haven't heard from her since. I guess I just want the family to know that I'm truly sorry and I didn't have anything to do with this, and I hope that Sydney is found very soon. She is a sweet, amazing girl.
Just 1 week later, Bailey would be arrested along with Aubrey in Missouri on warrants unrelated to Sydney's disappearance. They remained there on a federal hold and were interviewed by federal agents. Meanwhile, a large search was being carried out for Sydney. A Facebook page called Finding Sydney Loofe was set up to help share photos of her and encourage tips to pour in. People donated billboards, and a truck company with 10,000 employees passed out flyers to their truckers to put up wherever they went. The efforts to find Sydney were massive. Sadly, the search ended after 19 days when Sydney's body was found in Clay Center, Nebraska, a rural town 90 miles southwest of Lincoln. Her body had been chopped up and disposed of in several garbage bags. Parts of her body, including the heart and other lungs, were never found. A day later, a landlord called police to report a strong smell of bleach coming from the basement where Bailey Boswell and Aubrey Trail had lived together. Her alleged killers were soon tracked down in Branson, Missouri, and it did not take long before Aubrey began to talk. Aubrey insisted that Sydney was willingly participating in a sexual fantasy with him and at least 2 other women when she died. He said that her death was completely accidental. However, this proved to be false. Security footage was soon found from November the 15th, the last day that Sydney was alive. While Sydney had been at work that day, Bailey had sent her a message around noon asking how her day was going. Around the same time that the message was sent, phone records and security footage showed Bailey and Aubrey in the Menards parking lot. They had been shopping, purchasing tools, including a hacksaw, tin snips, and a utility knife at Home Depot. It seems that that evening, Bailey had picked Sydney up once again, just as the night before. This time, however, she drove Sydney back to the flat she shared with her secret boyfriend, who Sydney had known nothing about. Once she had tricked Sydney into the apartment, Aubrey Trail introduced himself. The jury has heard testimony from 3 other women who said that they were, at various times, in a relationship with Aubrey and Bailey. All of these relationships had started on Tinder. Aubrey has been very vocal that Bailey played no part in Sydney's murder. However, police did not believe this at all. During the sentencing, Aubrey slashed his neck whilst yelling, "Bailey is innocent and I curse you all." Police officers rushed over to help the 52-year-old man as he lay bleeding on the floor of the courthouse. In his statements to the court, Trail recanted his earlier claim that Loofe had died of erotic asphyxiation during rough intercourse, and admitted that he strangled her with an electric cord, as prosecutors had alleged. He said he tied up Loofe and killed her because she freaked out when he told her about his lifestyle, which included defrauding antique dealers and group sex with Boswell and other women. Sydney's remains, which were cut up into 14 parts, were found in trash bags, along with sex toys, a dog leash, and a plastic sauna suit. During the trial, witnesses who remained anonymous referred to Trail as the vampire leader of a witch cult. On the 9th of June 2021, Trail was sentenced to death for first-degree murder. In October, Boswell was also found guilty of first-degree murder. Parts of Sydney Loofe's dismembered body were shown to the panel of judges, including several photos of her arms, head, torso and thighs. The panel of 3 judges had the option of sending Boswell to death row, but chose not to do so, instead sentencing her to life in prison. Bailey Boswell will spend the rest of her life at the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women. The Facebook page, created for the purpose of finding Sydney, soon gained over 30,000 followers. This page was later renamed Celebrating Sydney Loofe. A $3,000 scholarship was also created in Sydney's name. The Set Me Free Project, an anti-trafficking non-profit organisation, will be granted to students pursuing careers in criminology, online safety, and social work.